Hello and welcome to episode 421 of Retro Encounter, RPG Fans' weekly podcast of many topics, usually of the retro variety. My name is Zach Wilkerson and I will be your host today. And we are here to do a follow-up on an episode that we did many years ago, and Hillary and I podcasted about Grandia I. And today we are here to talk about Grandia II. But unfortunately, Hillary is not joining us today, but fortunately, we have two other panelists, starting with you, Ben Love.
Hi.
And Claton Stevenson making his first ever appearance on Retro Encounter.
Hey, how's it going?
We're very excited to have you, Claton. Excited to chat about Grandia II, which is a game that when I first played it, I'm not sure there was ever a protagonist that I'm more related to, man. And I'll talk more about my feelings about Ryudo over the years.
We love Ryudo. I love Ryudo.
Oh, I do too. It's, I don't want to get into the weeds on this yet, but it almost feels like there's a different localizer working on Ryudo's dialogue. Because it's so much more clever than everyone else's.
Yeah, and he has some like anachronisms and things that he says that you wouldn't expect for like the setting or anything. Yeah.
It's almost like a little bit of like a working designs localization work there for a second. It's interesting. Yeah. Anyway, before we get to that, let's talk about sort of our history with the series or history with Grandia 2 in general. Whether you're a first timer, whether this is your third time playing like it is for me. So let's start with your history, Claton, with the Grandia series and especially Grandia 2.
Yeah, this was definitely my first time playing it. And in fact, like I know very little about the game. Like I think we had David Vink on the podcast recently, and that's sort of how I found out about the game through his YouTube videos. He's a big lover of it. It was actually my first imported Switch game. I got the HD remaster. There's no version here in Australia, so I got it from the Play Asia. Yeah, and it was sat on my shelf for a bit, and then I saw this podcast come up. I thought it's a good opportunity and good excuse to play it. So, yeah, first time.
Oh, that's excellent. I think I'm very curious to hear your experience as a first-timer, because for me, I think so much of my experience and feelings about this game are driven by how I felt about it when I was 14 years old.
Say, like hearing you guys talk about Ryudo and like your impressions of him as, I guess, as teenagers and young men, it's just like, yeah, I have a fairly different experience with him as a character for the first time. But yeah, we'll talk about that later, I suppose.
Oh, for sure. And what about you, Ben?
Yeah, so I actually got Grandia 2 when I got my Dreamcast in 2019. So I didn't play it back in the day, but I picked up a Dreamcast because I missed out on it when I was a kid, and it was one of the first games I got for it, and I totally fell in love with it. And then I went back and played Grandia 1 after that, and then played Extreme and Grandia 3. So I would say it made me fall in love with the series, and I love this game. For me, it's like the platonic ideal of like the traditional JRPG, because it is so kind of I don't want to say generic, but it hits like all the tropes, right? But I think it does them so well, and that's what I really love about it. And the battle system, of course, is excellent. So
yeah, I mean, like your feelings about it are very similar to mine, except for, again, I played it. I played it when I got my Dreamcast too, but I got it. That was like I got it like on $9.99, I think, whenever it came out. You guys remember that?
Yeah, the Dreamcast launch. Yeah,
it was crazy. And I was like a freshman in high school and disaffected. At least I thought I was. And I thought it was cool to be disaffected. But anyway, it was actually not the first Grandia game I played. I played Grandia 1 before it. And interestingly, I did not really enjoy Grandia 1 the first time I played it. I think it was because I was, that sort of teenager, and there's just so much optimism in Grandia 1. I'm like, what is this? Like, I want my cloud back. I want my...
Yeah, it's very Ghibli-esque, like kids on an adventure, kind of much different in tone than Grandia 2.
Yeah, and then I went to go play Grandia 2, and I remember I was on vacation at my grandparents' house in Florida, and it was raining all week, which most people would be really sad about. But for me, I was like, this is time for me to stay inside and play my video games. So I was very excited. I played through it in like 3 days. I just blasted right through it. I adored it. It wasn't my first Church is Bad RPG. But it was the first one that I really connected with. I think the first one for me was probably Breath of Fire 2, which is not a game I would recommend anybody go back and play, unless you somehow find a way to turn the encounter rate down. But yeah, and it just totally connected with me. Interestingly, and we'll get into this, I think that I maybe slightly prefer Grandia 1 today, because I love that optimistic feel, but man, do I hate those dungeons. And the
Yeah.
dungeons in this game don't suck, which is really nice.
Yeah. Yeah, 2 has a
So
lot of refinements, I
yeah,
think, over 1, and that part, that's the main reason why I prefer it over 1, but I get why people like 1 a lot.
I
It's more
dipped into Grandia
timeless.
1 like as a precursor to this, and honestly, I can't imagine trying to play that. If all the dungeons are the same, like that weird top-down look over the
hmm
environment, it's just awful. I couldn't
yeah,
stand it.
and they're like labyrinthine, and like that you'll be in a lot of dungeons. Like the runtime on Grandia 1 is longer than Grandia
Hmm.
2 by probably 10-15 hours,
Mm,
and I would say that all of those 10-15 hours are spent in dungeons.
right.
And the game's not overly hard, but you just get lost in it so much, and I really enjoy my time with it. But before we talk about sort of what defines Grandia, and I do want to talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the series in general. Grandia 2 comes out in 2000, I think, in Japan and America, and then maybe a little bit later in Europe. And apparently, you said it never came to Australia. Is that right, Clayton?
Oh, there was probably a PAL version.
Okay.
I can look this up, but yeah, look, the Dreamcast especially did not do well over here, so I can't imagine it.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, it was published by Ubisoft, so I think there probably is a PAL version.
That would make sense. Well, anyway, it comes out in 2000. It's developed by Game Arts, and Game Arts really at the time is known for two series. It's known for Grandia, which obviously was what we're here to talk about, but it was also known for Lunar. And it was always interesting for me when I was playing these games, because like I first came to Grandia because I loved Lunar. It's the same reason I first came to this site. And when I played Grandia, I was like, this isn't Lunar. And it wasn't hitting those same notes, but there are elements of Grandia that I think that sort of define what Game Arts is doing at the
Hmm.
time. And I think one of the most interesting things, and we can kind of talk about this in general, that I think is fascinating is that these two games are, and I hate to talk about Grandia 1 so much here, but I think it's kind of important to start with it. Grandia 1 is so optimistic, and at least to start, Grandia 2 seems the polar opposite of that. It's almost
Hmm.
like someone played Grandia 1, they developed it, then they went and read Catcher in the Rye. They were like, yeah, Holden, you're right. Which was exactly my experience. I first read Catcher in the Rye when I was like 12, and I read it and I was like, yeah, Holden, you're right. Everyone's phony. Then I read it when I was 18 and I was like, shut up, stop whining. And then I, read it when I was 30 and I was like, oh, I just feel bad for this kid. He's like abused. And that's kind of the way that I feel about Ryudo. But I think tonally, it feels so different. But there are also some things that sort of make it Grandia. And I think one of the things that I like about it that also makes it a Game Arts game is the way that the NPC interactions work.
Hmm.
I really like the NPC interactions. What have you guys sort of noticed about the NPC interactions, either this or Grandia 1? And sort of what are your takeaways from some of those NPC interactions?
Yeah, they're pretty. It's actually quite surprising how much unique NPC dialogue there is, and it seems fairly dynamic. Like it seems responsive to the plot and the situation that's happening around you. You could definitely spend a lot of time going and seeing every NPC at every like change that happens. But yeah, which is something I've done in RPGs, but I didn't feel too driven to do it here. But it's yeah, there's definitely a lot of NPC dialogue, and it's not generic. Like there's actually a bit of character to a lot of these NPCs.
Yeah, and for this playthrough, just because I was trying to get it done for the podcast, I didn't spend as much time doing that as I did my first time through. But I think it's striking how much detail there is in your interactions with both the NPCs and like the environmental details. So you're still dealing with like really, like the small towns that have like 5 or 6 houses and like the inn and the store and everything. But the environments are so detailed, and when you talk to characters, they have like interesting, things to say, or incidental dialogue that maybe suggests more about their character that you don't really get to see. One thing that comes to mind is the innkeeper. in I believe it's Aegir, the first town that you go to, and he kind of like has a little bit of back and forth with Ryudo, and like it suggests that he was like a geohound at one point, and there's not really much that comes from that, but it's just like really interesting to have that kind of like you when you talk to him and him knowing Ryudo and him and Ryudo having that back and forth. It's like, oh, this is, it makes it feel more lived in. Like these are characters that have this kind of backstory or something going on in their lives, and even if you're not going to see it, it kind of gives it that little bit of extra meaning and detail to your interactions.
Something to add to is like it's actually conversational. Like there's back and forth. You reply to the NPC, and as well, if you immediately talk to the NPC again, there's extra dialogue. Like you can actually push through with the NPCs and get way more than you would think. Like most people just go around, talk to them once, and walk away. But if you actually persist, there's more to be seen.
Yeah, and that's something too that I like about the little camp segments that you have with the party, where you'll kind of have, a character will say a line of dialogue, and then they'll prompt another character, and then you'll get different dialogue if you go to that character next, and they'll prompt the next character, and so it feels more organic.
It almost feels like a mini game, that camp scene thing, where you're like, are they prompting me to talk to them or who?
Oh, that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, I think that while I think that some of the character work here is not as strong as I think it probably is across the board in the first Grandia game, I do think that the NPC interactions, I think it's just fascinating to see, like, really Game Arts did it first. And like there are a whole series that sort of define themselves by that now, right? I'm not the biggest Trails fan,
Yeah.
but the Trails series absolutely owes so much of its identity to what Game Arts was doing at the time. And I think that it is an underrated element of what Grandia is doing. Because we'll talk about the battle system, and the battle system is fantastic. But I do think that there is more. There's more that defines it and that I think makes it interesting. But, since we're talking about it, might as well. Let's talk about the battle system before we really get into the story, because I think that if there is anything that people talk about when they talk about Grandia, it is the battle system. And I think the Grandia 2 does such a great job of refining what's happening in Grandia 1, because it feels a lot less random in terms of when you're canceling attacks and things like that. Now, granted, like I can't count the number of times I have been in the middle of like a downward swing with my sword to cancel an attack, and then I got hit by a super move, which is that's a skill issue. I mean, honestly, but it's so infuriating. But this game adds some other things to it as well, and they add some other refinements to it. So beyond just the battle system, which we'll get into more here, you've also got a skill system that sort of sits on top of it, where you have different skills, where you have SP that you're using. Everybody starts with a skill that has a cancel in it, which is really important. And then you have like these mana eggs that you can sort of toss around that have magic, and you're leveling them up. Luckily, not by using them over and over again, which is the way they level up in the first Grandia game, which was painful. And then you also have skill books where you can get like different stat bonuses. And it feels like for a game that is really linear in a lot of ways, it's actually remarkably linear. I'm only about halfway through it, and we're only going to be talking about sort of when we get to the Papal State here. It's so linear, but like, and the battle system isn't that challenging, but it still feels really good to be able to deal with skill progressions in the way that you can in this game. And that, coupled with the strength of the battle system, just makes it like every battle is fun for me in this game.
Yeah, I think it does a really good job of showing that you can have a lot of player expression even in a game that is structurally very linear. And I think you see that a lot with like modern games, like, I don't know, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, where you have like there's this idea to give more player expression or agency or whatever. You need to make the structure of the game more open and give the player all these side things to do. And I think Grandia 2 is just a really good example of like you have a lot of control over, as a player, over who is using what abilities and when you're unlocking certain things and how you're tailoring each character to your play style. But you don't need any of that extraneous stuff in the structure of the game. It can still have a really traditional structure, but the systems, the progression systems, and the combat system can allow for a lot of flexibility and depth and different approaches depending on the player.
I couldn't say enough good things about the battle system in this game. I'm a real systems head. I also love turn-based combat, but this is like it's almost real time with pause. It's still turn-based, but I mean it's really dynamic. You like not just timing your own moves, but sort of timing them around your other characters, and just trying to spread out the damage or like isolate the damage to like a boss or a more powerful enemy. It just feels really good. And you said that before, Zach. There's skill to it. It's not just all right. I set all the pieces in motion and off we go. You can really strategize and find ways to actually apply skill to the battles.
And the thing that I like a lot about the battle system itself is just how large that cancel window is.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one thing that is very different from Grandia 1, where in that game the cancel window was very short. It would usually happen really quickly, and like cancellation, like it was a really cool concept. But here, it feels like every single time I'm making a choice, it matters. Now, granted, like I think I've maybe struggled with one fight so far in this game, and it's one that I know Clayton struggled with as well, and we'll get to it. But it doesn't really matter because I think that so often, like I am the sort of person who will complain like, turn-based combat JRPGs too easy, too easy, too easy, too easy, and I get frustrated by that. But even in this game, where like things aren't necessarily super challenging,
Mm-hmm.
they're super thoughtful.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that is a huge boon to this game, and that ability to cancel attacks, that thinking about how long the cast time is going to take on every single move, no matter what you're doing, I think is super cool.
Yeah, it's very engaging. I mean, I think that the Grandia battle system really nails like what ATB, like in Final Fantasy, was trying to do, like to give a turn-based combat system more, to make it feel more dynamic, like when you're playing. But I personally, I don't feel like the ATB traditional ATB system really ever did that. But because you can manipulate the enemy's turns through canceling their attacks or pushing them further back on the timeline, and there's so much variety in the way that your decisions impact how your character's moves are going to happen, like in sequence, that just makes it feel so much more like dynamic and like hectic. And you it makes you want to pay attention, even if the consequences for death, or you have a lot of resources in this game. It likes to throw resources at you, and they're very cheap, and money's plentiful, and all that, right? So you're not really going to be failing that much, but it doesn't really matter because there's so much immediacy and to all the little small decisions you make, and you're constantly making them because it's always somebody's turn, or it's always the enemy's turn doing something that you then have to react to and change your strategy. It really gets like what's engaging about like an action based system, but then applies it to that turn based structure.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you guys said. The only time that I get a little bit frustrated by it, is when there are like 8 enemies on the field, and I can't tell. They all have like the same icon,
Oh yeah,
and so I can't tell which one I should be targeting at any given moment.
and
And
they
that,
do overlap
yeah,
sometimes, so
Mm.
then you really
yeah,
can't really see. Yeah.
right. But that is like the smallest complaint, because it's just all these 24 years later after this game came out, it's still I can't think of turn-based combat like from a system like a
Hmm.
baseline perspective that I enjoy more. I
Mm.
just can't. And I love me some turn-based combat, but man, this is it's special, and it makes what I think is still a pretty fun game on a broader scale, even more engaging.
Yep, definitely.
I'm trying to think of anything else about Grandia that really makes it stick out as a Grandia game, as a Grandia 2 as a Grandia game. Anything else that you wanted to kind of dig into before we start digging into some of the characters here and things like that?
The soundtrack, I
Oh
would
yeah.
say it's Noriyuki Iwadare, and I think that's like so the soundtrack is so key to the series identity, both with Grandia 1 and then Grandia 2. And there's some really great tracks in this game. I think the town tracks really stand out to me. So like A Gear Town, The what is it? Ligwe is the second town that you go to, and then Murumu Village. I think all of those tracks are really really good. And it's a great battle theme, obviously, and but I think that the music is just really central to the series identity.
I don't know if it makes it a Grandia game, but I found the traversal pretty fun too. Like there's some small environmental puzzles and like missable, I guess, like back alleys or secret areas where you can find some pretty decent items, and it's pretty generous too. If you find like a secret sort of treasure chest, it'll just have 4 or 5 decent items in it. Yeah, I found that pretty rewarding when there's a lot of forking in the traversal, so there'll be like 2 or 3 paths you can take. You can sort of just go, okay, I'm going to go this way, and then you find out that just progresses the plot or whatever. But yeah, it sort of pays to look around, play around. The secrets are never too secret. It's just, yeah, I found that stuff. I love treasure hunting in dungeons, and this gave you a lot of that to do.
I think that's a really good observation. And, it is Grandia. Grandia 1 certainly did the exact same thing, except for it was very punishing and very frustrating um, when you were making wrong turns. I remember there was one dungeon in Grandia 1 where you literally could fall through a hole if you weren't paying attention that took you back to the very beginning of the dungeon. And the dungeon was like an hour long.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And it was like, it wasn't supposed to be a trap. It was just like a
oversight.
You can't see sort of situation. And I think they were trying to play around with that sort of rotating camera the same way that
And
go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, doesn't Grandia 1 have random encounters also?
I actually can't remember.
Yeah, they're not on screen. They're
okay.
Yeah, so
okay.
And that's another thing that makes it a little less frustrating in Grandia 2 is they're all on screen, and you can avoid them pretty reliably too.
Yeah.
If you need to.
And I think at the time, a lot of games were trying to play around with that camera movement thing. Like I think about like a Breath of Fire 3 or 4. I think about a Grandia 1 and a Grandia 2 where like that rotating your camera allows you to see more secrets. And so often, like in some of those other games, I felt like I was punished for not doing it constantly. Like Breath of Fire 4 in particular is a game that I find very frustrating on that front. Xenogears did it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this game, it feels, I don't even know, I don't have a smarter way of saying this. It feels fun. It feels like I agree with everything you said, Clayton. Like it just feels like there's a little discovery here and there. There's a little bit like there's one dungeon where you are like trying to like kick rocks down slopes, and if you kick the rock down the slope, and it's not very difficult to figure out where the rock is or what to do with the rock, but it's still there. It's still engaging. And then it opens up that treasure chest that has like 3 solid items in there for you. And so and they none of them overstay their welcome, so the traversal feels fun because you're not going to get lost constantly either.
Yeah, it's like it gives you an extra thing to do in a dungeon other than just like running down a corridor, but it never like roadblocks your progress really. So it feels like different, but it's not. You'll never get stuck, which is good because then that can like really kill the pacing, and the pacing in this game I think is just really strong.
Yeah, I'm actually interested after I've finished this game to go and watch a speed run of it because I actually think you could absolutely smash through some of these environments. It doesn't feel like that when you're there, like there's plenty of content and stuff, but I think you could just absolutely mainline it, run through, skip a heap of stuff. And yeah, I'd be interested to see how quickly you could get this game done.
Yeah, and I agree about the pacing. And I feel like every time I'm on this podcast or any podcast recently, I talk about pacing, and it's something that matters to me, especially in some of these old school games. And I think that it gets you going right away, right? Like the story, sort of some general background about the story. It's sort of like sometime in the distant past, and this is at least what we're told, there was like this fight between these 2 great gods, Granus and Valmar. And Valmar was the evil one, Granus was the good one. And then to defeat Valmar, they have to like sort of split the pieces of Valmar across like sort of the land. And so there might be wings somewhere sort of sealed away. There might be eyeballs or a tongue sealed away somewhere. And that's sort of like the background of what's happening here, but they don't really go into that. It's like we have like this like lore dump or something, because we don't need it, because this is really a story about, for the most part, about 2 people, or 3 people, I guess, depending on how you think about it. And so the game opens immediately with Ryudo, who is our main character. who is a geohound, and he is a mercenary. We don't know so much about, like, we know that people kind of look down on them and they sort of see them as like these sort of less than people, but they're mercenaries who sort of do the dirty work.
I
And
almost
he's
interpret
pulled
them
in.
as like the Witcher, almost like they're these kind of
Yeah,
Yeah,
journeyman
that's a good
monster hunters.
comparison.
that's a good
Yeah.
comparison. Yeah, you're right. And I'm literally playing through The Witcher 3 right now. I should have made that comparison. It's a good one. You come to a town and you're hired by this priest who wants you to take Elena to, and Elena is like a songstress, is a, you know, sort of an important member of the church, and he just wants you to take her on a trip to a tower where she's going to go through a ritual of some sort. They don't tell you anything about the ritual. They basically just say, like, you go do the thing. The ritual goes wrong, and then Ryudo has to rush in and save the day. And turns out you find a character there named Millennia, who is the wings of Valmar. It seems like she's probably a villain, who has sort of taken over the body of Elena. And this all happens in the first 45 minutes, right? Like, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's
It
very
doesn't.
quick.
They don't take their time on this, but
Which is
um,
another big difference between it and Grandia 1.
oh, that's for
Because
sure. And
Grandia 1 has a super prolonged intro.
in that town that I could never figure out where I was
Mhm.
going, not being able to figure out where I was going was like the theme of my last Grandia playthrough. But yeah, but I think that what's cool about it too is that we are introduced to these two characters very, very clearly. Elena is a priestess. I don't think she's very interesting, but I don't think she's supposed to be very interesting. And Ryudo is, love him or hate him, he's a character. um, he is acerbic. He's witty. He has a very dark sense of humor. He makes fun of everybody. He seems to dislike literally the fact that anyone else is breathing next to him. Um, he is about as edgelord as edgelord comes. But man, I love him. I think
Yeah,
he's super fun.
he's great. Yeah.
I think he just adds so much personality to this game. But you'll also discover later that, you know, he's like, I kind of got a heart of gold, and he's got like a traumatic past, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think
But
it does a really good job of like giving you these characters and these kind of like Elena and Ryudo are both kind of like very tropey, and then it kind of starts them in that place so that they have room to grow into something else, which I think the game does a really good job of, especially with Ryudo. Like, he's definitely a very different character at the end than he was at the beginning, and that's satisfying, I think, as in his character progression. That's something that I think a lot of games like this sometimes miss out on, especially for like the protagonist, who is often just like a do-gooder from the start, and you really get to see that progression with him, which I think is really interesting and fun.
I feel they almost go too far for me, making him such, like, I shouldn't swear, but like, he's such an asshole from the beginning for me. He just says some really nasty stuff, and like he's pretty sexist. I think, you know, put it in the
yeah,
context of the time, almost not, like it's pretty rough.
no, the misogyny is something. I'm glad you called it out, and
Yeah,
it's troubling. I agree.
definitely. Like, it's, yeah, just cruel. But yeah, like you said, you know, not making him a super good guy and just a goody two shoes. I think that has its place in it, and it's like part of the tone of this. But yeah, it's almost too much from the start. Where I'm like, I think I hate this guy from the beginning. But yeah, look, they give you those little glimpses of, like you said, that heart of gold. You could, and again, they could do with more of that, I think, early on. But yeah, I'm interested to see how he develops toward the end. I'm only halfway through at the moment, so he's starting to soften.
He does have his reasons and his background that kind of plays into why he is that way at the beginning. But of course, you know, Zach and I are approaching it from hindsight, where we know that about him already, and
Yeah.
so it's interesting to hear your opinion of him without that. And then I'll be interested to see what you think next time we record, once you've
Yeah.
actually seen that, and see if that changes your opinion of him at all. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be his biggest fanboy next time. Who knows?
Yeah, it's funny because and I agree with you, Clayton. I think that they go so far with it to make him, like, it's almost like they want to make him unlikable to some people, but they also wanted him to be a late 90s
Mhm.
JRPG protagonist. But he's also got more life to him than a lot of those
Mm-hmm.
than the Squallian hearts of the world. No offense. He's got more life to him than that.
Yeah, he has a lot of personality. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I agree with you, but I think that it's refreshing even now, 24 years later, just to see them lean into it so hard that they like, it's almost like he's like a pro wrestler.
Yeah, he's
He's
a bit
like
of a
such a
heel.
heel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
That I think for me that like it's fun, but I can totally see why he wouldn't vibe. I think that our editor in chief doesn't really like this game very much, and I think it's because he doesn't like Ryudo. And I think that's a
They do
totally
something
reasonable
with it
response.
though. I think like they do something with it, and he has a reason for being that way, and he
Right.
has a reason to, yeah, like, and they, you know, he starts out that way so that you can be satisfied with where he is at the end. And I think it kind of sets the template too. Like, he reminds me a lot of both Yuri Hyuga in Shadow Hearts, and also Luke from Tales of the Abyss. I think they're both kind of modeled somewhat on Ryudo. And that kind of, they
Two
start out as
games
like,
I desperately need to play. Everybody
yeah.
who knows me is like, you haven't played those two games? Like, you've played like these 7 other Tales games that have nothing burgers of stories, but you haven't played Tales of the Abyss yet? Come on. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You definitely, Zach. You got to play Tales of the Abyss for sure. But yeah, they both, you know, where you have that kind of anti-hero character who has some kind of negative character traits at the beginning, but through their interaction with some of the other characters they meet on the journey and things that happen, they kind of grow to be into something different and more mature. And maybe they still have some of those, you know, snarky personality aspects, but in a more, you know, acceptable or you know, moral package that you're happier with at the end of the game. And it's cool just to see a game like really want to focus on that kind of character development, because I think a lot of times, you know, you do see that in a lot of traditional, you know, old school RPGs, but I think it's less common with the actual protagonists of the game. Often because I think they want them to be more of like a blank slate, and Ryudo is definitely not that, right? Like, he is a very well defined character, and that's what I really like about him.
Yeah, who I do love as a character is Melania. She's
Yeah.
just like comes out of the gate
Yes,
real hard.
yes.
She's almost like, she's pretty edgy as well. She's, you know, I guess evil. She's evil coded, but then yeah, I don't know how they deal with the whole she's suddenly just party a party and you just accept that. But she's like real funny, real like she's edgy. She's got her own energy. Yeah,
Yeah.
I fell in love with her from minute one. I was like, yeah, I like her.
Yeah.
This is definitely a game that was coded for 14-year-old Zach, so I agree. I was like, oh, that's my type. Okay, I understand now.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that she's delightful, and I think it's a fair contrast to draw between like who Ryudo is, who is, you know, our protagonist and is supposed to be a good guy, and obviously is not at the beginning, not really at least. And her, who's like supposed to be like this force of evil, but like she's able to be witty and fun, without necessarily just constantly like belittling every single human being she ever interacts with.
Yeah,
So I
she's a
think
bit of a
it's,
trickster, kind of like a
yeah,
Loki almost.
I could see that for sure. So after we meet these 3 characters, we after and the ritual goes bad, we end up sort of having to go then take a trip to Granus, which is the capital of I don't know, like the papal state, and to go meet with, is he actually called the Pope in this
He's a
game?
pope. Yeah.
Okay, I thought so.
Pope
Uh,
Innocent Hera Innocentius or something like that.
yeah, I mean, this game is not subtle, is it? It is not subtle. So you have to go off to then go figure out what's going on with Millennia, who has sort of, you know, invaded Elena's body, and then, you know, that's when we get into sort of the rhythm of what the game is. You go to a town, there's a problem there. A lot of times, we discover that problem is because one of the you know, pieces of Valmar
Mhm.
has taken over someone at that point, and you meet people along the way. So the one of the first towns you go to, you meet a kid named Roan, who's sort of, I think he's part of the carnival group, right?
He was like tagging along with the
Okay,
carnival group, but he he has his own identity that we'll find out later. But yeah, he
Yeah.
was just kind of like a hanger on, I think.
Okay. And I'm going to shout out Roan for being a kid who, outside of the voice acting, we haven't talked about the voice acting in this game, but it's deliciously terrible most of the time. And I think sometimes his is too. But like he's like a little kid character who's like not super annoying.
Yeah, he's not that
Um,
annoying. Yeah.
and that's like a pretty big accomplishment in my world. I can't
I
really
think
say
so.
much else about him, but he doesn't make me want to throw my controller at the screen. So like that's a big W in my world.
They haven't given him a lot of time in the first part of the game. Like he's pretty just like a tag along.
Yeah, and I think if there is like one major like criticism of the characters and like storytelling in this game, I would say they kind of leave the side characters like kind of on the back burner a good bit. They don't get as much development as Elena and Ryudo and Millennia do. And Roan is definitely, I think, like probably the worst example of that, or the best example of them not doing that well, because he just kind of is like that. And there's not a lot to him, but he's not annoying, and that's great. That's like the best thing a little kid character in an RPG can be, is not annoying.
Like, it's exactly right though, Ben. Like you meet Marag later, and we'll talk about him. But like he has this burning vengeance that he wants to take part in, and then it's instantly just put on the back burner for him, and he just sits in the back and hangs out. Like I'm sure it gets developed later, but yeah,
Yeah.
it goes from like
And
the
he
roaring lion to just hanging out.
and he'll say like sort of these vaguely wisdom-y
Yeah.
things, which I say that way on purpose. I'm like, that doesn't actually make any sense, but nice try. Like he's giving advice, and I'm like, it sounds really nice when you say that metaphorically, but I don't think that actually makes sense. And I think localization on this game is generally quite good. Like,
Yeah.
for a 2000 RPG, I think it's actually it's fantastic,
Mhm.
and especially for an Ubisoft localization. Not sure who they hired for this one, but they went all out for like maybe once in the whole lifetime of that company.
Yeah, it's definitely their best localization. They did a few RPGs around this time. I don't know, like what made them start doing like Japanese to English localization, but I can understand why they stopped, because most of the games they worked on, I think the localizations weren't good. But this one is actually surprisingly good for both for them, and I think just for the time in general. Like very strong. The writing's good. There's definitely some stuff like we were talking about at the beginning, like almost like working designs esque like liberties maybe taken with it, but not in a way that I think like takes away from the storytelling or characters or anything. It's very solid for the time, and definitely better than like the vast majority of PS1 RPG localizations for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it sort of takes up the banner of what Working Designs was doing,
Mm-hmm.
because for whatever you want to say about Working Designs, the work they did was important,
Yeah.
um, in giving character to things that had the character but that had not previously been localized.
Mhm.
And so in this game, as I'm sort of playing through it, I'm like, man, like the writing here, it feels modern. Like if
Mhm.
this game came out in 2024, I would say the localization is good, the writing
Yeah.
is good,
Yeah.
um better than, like, I don't know, I just played a Yuden Chronicle, and the writing is a damn sight better here than it is in that game. So it's interesting, just to sort of see them use that strength and see them pull up the banner of what's happened before. I really would like to know, like, I guarantee whoever worked on this game went on to go work on really cool stuff for some other company.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, and it's like it feels like what the best of working designs did without all their worst excesses. That's what I that's how I would kind of describe it. It's like I like the little bit of extra personality, or maybe the more like word choices or reference choices that they pick, but they don't date the game, and they don't feel super out of place or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the localization in this game really is remarkable. But I agree with everything you guys said in terms of the side characters too. Like I feel like it's a little inconsistent sometimes, where it's good, it's never bad. You know what I mean? Like even like Elena is like never poorly written. Merrick is maybe maybe not great, but you compare it to like something like Ryudo, where the localization seems so strong, and it's just interesting where you can sort of see that they definitely had different people working on different pieces and parts of it, and you usually can't see the seams that carefully or that clearly.
Yeah, I was disappointed with Merrick because I like the big strong characters, like your Barretts and stuff like that. So I wanted him to be like the almost the father figure, the big strong guy. But yeah, he just feels undercooked, unfortunately.
Yeah, and there's more to him, and there'll be a little bit more for him, as we get further. But yeah, he kind of, I do think they don't give him as much time in the spotlight as maybe he should have had to have a little bit more like
Yeah,
impact to the party. Yeah,
I think that's true with one of the characters you get later as well, a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah.
Even though that character breaks the game wide open. Um, yeah. So like I said, after you sort of go on that adventure, you're sort of meeting up with people and going into these different towns. And I think it's one of the things that I really like about this game. Like as a big Dragon Quest fan, I like sort of the structure of go to a town, find out a problem, fix the problem, move on. And I think that they're pretty compelling problems. I think that, and they're pretty interesting. Like for example, when you get to, there's a town where you have to get onto like a skyway to get to the papal state, and all the people of that town can't taste their food. And at first, that seems like, oh, it's not that bad, right? But they can only eat like this one like mushy, crappy food that's apparently like someone thought was a delicacy coming in, um, and I think it's really you can see like, and because that NPC dialogue is so strong, it allows that sort of moment to moment, like sort of town to town storytelling to be really strong, and for us to really invest in it, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, and it reminds me a lot of Osamu Tezuka's Dororo, which I don't know if either of you are familiar with, but it has like that same concept where it's like killing, he's killing demons to get piece of his body back. And so I think that might be kind of where they got the concept from. But then you also have that layer of like whatever the piece of Valmar it is, like plays into whatever the curse or the thing that the town is experiencing, and then it's almost like there's a kind of like lesson about humanity they try to do like wrapped in that, right? Like, so for the first town, with the tongue of Valmar, it's about like greed, right? And then with the eyes of Valmar, it's more about like perception of other people and judging other people. And I think that works well thematically with the game. Even if I can kind of tell where they're pulling it from, and it is kind of like a something like a seven deadly sins kind of thing almost, which is you see a lot in a lot of stories, but I think it's done well here, and it just gives it a little bit of extra, I think, like depth to what is a pretty like bog standard like RPG story.
And yeah, it's exactly what I thought with the tongue of Valmar, like that town. I thought, oh, okay, I see what they're going to do. They're going to do the seven deadly sins, but it's not exactly that. I guess it's, there is seven pieces of Valmar, but it's like, yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And what I like about the way they've worked it is, it is that sort of town dungeon boss structure, but it makes the town quite like elevated in that equation. Like you sort of have to steep yourself in the culture of the town. There's some really good unique designs in the town and character designs. You actually spend a bit of time exploring the town rather than
Mm-hmm.
like a Dragon Quest. You go there and then you're sent away into the field to find a
Mm-hmm.
dungeon and go into the dungeon, and then the dungeon has a lot more screen time. This actually kind of places you in the town a lot more, and I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Clayton. There's like a little bit of you always have to like it's not, you're doing a little bit of detective work. Like you got to go around and talk to people to kind of get to like the heart of what's actually going on, and that usually takes a bit of time and forces you to really interact with NPCs and get a little bit more backstory on what's going on, which definitely just makes the world feel more alive,
Mm.
and the characters in each little story more realized, so you care more about each like vignette than you maybe would in like a Dragon Quest game, which I think you're totally right. Like in Dragon Quest, it has that similar style of storytelling, but with the exception of like maybe Dragon Quest 7, you're not necessarily getting that personal connection or feeling as connected to the events of each town's struggles as you are in Grandia 2. I think it's something that does really strongly.
Yeah, I mean that didn't even vaguely occur to me, and I think that's a brilliant point. And I think that it allows the game to lean into its strengths, right?
Hmm.
Like the game has those strengths of those NPCs, and because you're spending so much time in the towns, like you could probably go talk to the same NPC like 7 different times
Hmm.
over the course of the events, and you would get different responses every time. And it really helps to I think it helps to not only flesh out the world, but it also helps to flesh out and make sort of subtext Ryudo's character growth. You can see
Hmm.
why
Yeah,
Ryudo is growing the way that he is because and it's not just being shoved down our throats. It's something that we are consistently seeing.
it feels very
Um,
organic. Yeah.
yeah, it's a good way of putting it. And I think it's really strong storytelling.
Yeah, and I think the plotting too is very good. Like things don't just happen randomly or feel like there's like a Deus Ex Machina happening or whatever. Like you like a good example is when you get to Marumu Village. They think that you're the high priestess coming there because they've requested that the high priestess come, and then they find out like, oh, Elena's not that. You're just travelers or whatever. But then she does end up coming, and so you get that kind of like foreshadowing that there is something that's going to happen, and then that brings, when she shows up with the knights, like gives higher stakes to what's going on. And like, if you there's a feeling like, if they fail to like get to the bottom of it, then the whole town could be destroyed. And so it just makes, you have more investment in what's happening. And also they just do a really good job of like sprinkling in details, or it's very believable. The events are always very believable. It's not like they just pulled something like out of their hat. It all is consistent and makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of putting it. In terms of thinking about the plotting in general, like it never feels like it's slowing down in a way that would be frustrating. Like a lot of times, like I'm the sort of person who, especially as I've gotten older, I'm like, all right, I see the dialogue. Just I've got enough of it. Let's move on. Whereas now in this game, I feel like because of the way that it uses sort of the environment and the people of the environment, um, to sort of lay the groundwork for it, it allows the pacing to also continue to move, and we're not just being hit with cutscene after cutscene after cutscene of stuff. And I think that's really cool. So yeah, I mean, I think that the only thing that we really haven't talked about too much yet is some of the battles, which I think can be pretty tough when they're bosses in this game.
Hmm.
Like if for me in particular, the Eyes of Valmar gave me some trouble, um, and it's just because there are so many things happening on screen at once. It's like 7 different enemies you can attack, and like you're trying
Yeah.
to figure out how to cancel every single one of their attacks, and you can't even see the HP of one of them, and you don't know what they're all doing. But it felt fair, and like as I was sort of moving my way through it, and I just think that's a really good example of what the boss fights are like in this game. As I was sort of doing the fight, I was learning it as I was going, but not in a way that felt like overly punishing. And so, like, I think that again, they understood exactly how to sort of leverage their battle system. Like, I haven't played Grandia Extreme, which I've heard does a great job
Hmm.
with the battle system, if nothing else. Grandia 3 as well, which is another game I have not played because I haven't heard great things about either of them. But one thing I have heard is that they allow you to leverage that battle system really well.
Yeah.
And I can see how that would work with some of these boss battles.
Yeah, coming into, I think all the boss battles are pretty cool so far. But yeah, Eye of Valmar, those little eye drones, they do this delta attack on you. So I guess you start to try and work out, okay, delta, is it like if I can destroy one of them, will that stop? You got to try and focus in your damage on them because it's just really super punishing, like high damage. And then, yeah, start to clean up the actual Eye of Valmar. And it in itself is pretty hard. It sort of forced me to stop. Like the first couple of times, I just got absolutely railed. I stopped and went, okay, let's spend some points in this, like into the skill system and everything. I need to do some crowd control. I need to put some stuff to sleep. I need to nullify some magic. It was just, I found it really like, as much as I was losing and losing hard, I found it fun because I was like, I want to figure this out. It's like a
Mm-hmm.
puzzle. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a real highlight from start to finish. Like the way you come into the Garden of Dreams and you meet that, like the little girl, and she's just like really, I guess I sort of interpret it as like almost like a fairy or maybe even a demon or something at first, and then it just has this actual like a pretty human story inside the town, about the daughter and about the mother, and the mother's like has to make like a really awful decision, and yeah, and like bawling her eyes out, and it's really human. And then you have that high priestess or whatever come in, and she's just an awful, nasty, the worst of the worst of that church. And then I guess you get that glimpse into, hang on, like maybe the bad guy here is the church, even though you're fighting these pieces of armor. You're like, well, hang on, like these guys are supposed to be on the good side, and they're just awful, like ready to pretty much commit genocide to sort their issues out. Yeah, it was a real highlight.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think it in the it gives there's a lot of like it gives a lot more like thematic and emotional weight to, you know, the the boss fight at the end and just all the event, the events overall. Um, I think it is like a high point of the game. It's also when you start to see the most like I think change or the initial changes in Ryudo. Like even though he's already kind of warmed up to Elena at this point, he's like okay with like Marek and Roan following them around. Like this is really where you see like him react to these things in a way that you can tell it's connecting with him personally, and I think they do a really good job of showing that. Like the little girl Ira is like the first character where you can see that he's not just like having sympathy or begrudgingly going along. He's like directly empathizing with her and her feeling of being kind of ostracized or from everyone else and judged and mistreated. And I think that's really powerful too. And it makes his inability to save her and really impactful. I think for his character and for you as the player, because it's like, oh, like there are real consequences to this, and there wasn't really like a resolution that was really you know good and happy ending kind of thing.
Yeah.
um
No, I
yeah.
think that's really exactly right. It's you kept expecting the happy ending, and then it completely flips it, and you're like, okay, I couldn't make this good. I couldn't make it right. And yeah, they don't do that enough in RPGs. There's too much, like it's all wrapped up in a nice little bow, but this definitely wasn't. But you still felt like you had an interesting experience.
hmm Yeah, and there's even like a little bit of like growth for Millennia too, because at the end, she's
Hmm.
like her aims, her goal, which was to take the Eye of Valmar, like she got what she wanted, and then despite that, though, like Ryudo's upset and everyone else is upset, and so she, you know, basically, it's implied she's like lying to to Sandra, the mother, like, oh well, if you there's a flower there still growing. If you plant more flowers, then they'll grow. And then Ryudo's like, well, did you did you just make that up? And she's like, well, I don't really, she's like, I don't really want to say, but it shows like, oh, she's starting to care about people other than herself. Because there's really no, before this, it's all been like, well, she's helping Ryudo and she's helping them because, it's according to what she wants or needs, right? But here's an example of her going out of her way to like do a kindness for someone. And that's like very seemingly out of character for her. So I think that was like a really good moment too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that whole sequence almost feels like it's almost like its own self-contained thing that could almost be its own game, right? Like it feels like a lot of games would have just made that the game, and I think that they managed to leverage that story into doing so many things without explaining it either. You know what I mean? Like you're talking about the growth of Ryudo. It's not something that anyone really calls out. I mean, occasionally Elena's like, "Oh, Ryudo really does like people." Oh, but for the most part, it's respecting the player, and
Mhm.
respecting our ability to understand how that growth is happening. And I think that both of you covered everything I would have to say about it otherwise extremely well. But after that, we do arrive at the Papal State finally. But that is where we are going to stop because I thought that was a good place for us to sort of start off next time so we can also sort of start off with a bang for part two. Because I know there's a lot that happens there. And the narrative starts to shift pretty dramatically in a lot of ways. It doesn't lose what makes the game, but it definitely things become more clear, at least eventually, pretty soon here. So, is there anything in particular, Ben, that you're looking forward to without spoiling anything? You're looking forward to in part 2, and Claton, is there anything that you're curious sort of to see, like sort of where it goes in part 2?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to, I think there's a lot of good, dungeons and boss fights and a lot of good like character reveals and some really like heart wrenching moments in the story to come. So I'm just excited to kind of experience it all again with like kind of a fresh perspective. There's so many little things that I've noticed this time that I didn't necessarily pick up on my first playthrough. So I'm really just enjoying like experiencing it again, and I feel just as strongly positively about it now as I did the first time I played through it. So it's been fun like revisiting it.
Yeah, well, having the church sort of really start to be fleshed out now, and being in the papal state, and I'm just interested to see how that church develops, because it's still not clear if they, truly are the big bad, or there seems to be people within the church with different motivations from each other. But as well, like the whole Melania thing, she, ostensibly is the wings of Valmar. She's collecting these other pieces of Valmar, so like it feels like it's building up to a confrontation with her or something. Like her motivations are going to definitely clash with ours, and I'm sort of scared and interested to see that, because I like her as a character so much. But yeah, that's something I'll be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I'm excited to play through because I honestly don't remember the second half of this game very well at all. So, but I mean that in a good way. I
Yeah.
know we haven't talked at all about Melphis, but obviously
Yeah,
Melphis
that's what I was
becomes
going to mention. We didn't talk at all about him, and
significant.
he's going to come in. I think that's a really strong just part of the game, like storytelling wise and everything. So
That's certainly a boss fight too.
yes,
Um,
yep.
so yeah, but thanks both of you so much for taking the time to chat with me about this game. It's a game that's long been a favorite of mine. And I was excited to chat with both of you, and I thought it turned out really well. So thank both of you. So let's talk about what's coming up next on Retro Encounter. So next week was originally I think supposed to be this week, but we kind of flipped some things around. Next week we're going to have a Yuden Chronicle spoiler cast about 100 Heroes. We've got a big panel for that. A lot of people were very excited to play it. I've played it, so if you've listened to other podcasts, you know what my thoughts are. But I'll be there too. And then the week after that, we'll have another episode on Grandia II. And then next month, our game journal is going to be Dark Souls. The original Dark Souls is our game journal for July, which I think is appropriate given that Shadows of the Erdtree, the massive,
Yeah,
apparently, expansion to Elden Ring is coming out. I'm
it's
really
good
excited to
timing.
hear your thoughts on that. It's not my favorite of the Dark Souls games, but I really enjoyed it a lot, and there's a lot to unpack with that game. The level design in that game is just astoundingly good. And we're not sure about everything else in July yet. We do know we're going to have an episode about some of our favorite PS4 games, because yes, that is a retro topic at this point. Yes, I am that old. And then there's some other things that are up in the air, but that's where we are with July at this point.
Did that feature already come out, Zach?
No, it's related
Oh,
to that feature.
so okay, yeah.
Yeah, it is related to it. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us retro@rpgfan.com. If you want to get in touch with us other ways, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Twitter, or X, whatever you call it nowadays, Twitch, YouTube. Um, Basically, usually RPG Fan or RPG Fan.com. You can also find us on Discord. You can also find us through both of our shops. We have a shop now hosted by TeePublic that has all kinds of RPG Fan merch, like t-shirts, mugs, things like that. So you can rep one of my favorite designs on the internet, always has been, the RPG Fan shield. And you can also buy our review card book published by Hyperplay RPG. With over 300 pages of review cards of a variety of different games. It kind of looks like an old school magazine. It's really cool. I'm looking at it right now, flipping through it. It's just I don't know. It's not just exciting because my name's in print. I promise. It's really cool. And you can find links to both of those things on RPG Fan. We also have two other podcasts. One of them is Random Encounter. It's the Monday of every 2 weeks, hosted by John O. Logan, usually about current events, current topics, sometimes about current things that we're running on the site. And then the other week is Rhythm Encounter, which is about RPG fan music, usually hosted by Mike Salvato. You can review us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, any sort of anywhere you can find podcasts. You'll probably find ours. And we'd love feedback, especially the 5-star variety. And before we sign off, I want to make sure everybody knows how to get in touch with our 2 panelists, starting with you, Ben.
Yeah, you can email me at benloganlove@gmail.com.
Awesome. And what about you, Clayton?
I don't really use social media, but what I really want to see is like talk in the comments of articles on RPG Fan. It's it's an underutilized part. So if you want to talk to me in the comments, even if it's not an article that I'm involved in, or it's this podcast. Just chat with me there.
That's true. I honestly forget we have comments a lot because they are so underutilized, and I think that's a great piece of advice for our readers. And if you want to get in touch with me, the best way is email zachw@rpgfan.com. I'm also at least active, not like talking, but active on our Discord as Zach W. And thanks again so much for 2 of you for joining me on this podcast. I had a lot of fun. Thought you guys had a lot of really great things to say. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys again in a couple weeks about the rest of Grandia II. And thank you, panelists. Thank you, listeners. Good night and good luck.